The sound that defines a faith for generations is not the sermon or the chant, but the bell. Its peal marks the rhythm of the sacred, calls to prayer, announces relief or mourning. In the mountains of Thessaly, in the year 1470, the bell of the convent of St. Catherine rang with a metallic clarity that pierced the morning mist. But that peal, on April 23rd, did not usher in a day of work and prayer. It was a farewell, a sound that echoed through the valley, never to return. Within the stone walls, 23 women dressed in coarse wool knelt in the cold chapel. Their lips moved in unison, forming Latin words repeated 1,000 times. Yet that morning, the syllables tasted of ash. Outside, the horizon was not tinged with the soft pink of dawn, but with a sinister, shifting crimson. It was not heaven. They were the banners of the Ottoman Empire, a tide of golden crescents above a sea of men, steel and gunpowder flowing down the hill, obliterating the landscape. The army wasn't marching. It was advancing like a geological force, unstoppable. The abbess, Sister Eleni, clutched a silver crucifix that had outlived 3 generations of her family. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. They trembled with absolute certainty. She and all her sisters knew what was coming. What none of them, nor the world around them, could even imagine was that death would have been a mercy. Because what would happen next wasn't recorded in the history books you studied. It was buried, erased, hidden under layers of silence for centuries, until the physical evidence carved into the stone itself screamed its truth. The last bell of Thessaly. The convent of St. Catherine was not a fortress. It was a refuge. Built on a remote hillside, far from garrisons and major trade routes, its existence revolved around the silent cycles of prayer, manual labor, and charity. Its inhabitants were not warriors. They were women whose lives had been shaped by silence and devotion. Sister Magdalena, barely 19, still bore the calluses on her palms inherited from her father's farm, lost in a raid years before. For her, the convent was the only place where the world had ceased to be a site of terror. Sister Theodora, 70, had buried 2 abbesses, seen emperors fall, and survived more wars than she could count. Death, for her, was a familiar companion, not a threat. And at the center, Sister Eleni, the abbess. A woman who hadn't come to the convent to escape the world, but to try to make sense of it after a plague swept through the village where she cared for the sick. Her weapons were rosaries. Her armor, faith. Her victory, silent perseverance. None of them had ever wielded a sword. Until that morning, they believed they would never need to. The first cannon shot struck just after the last echo of the bell faded. It didn't hit the door or the walls. The projectile, with devastating precision, struck the base of the bell tower squarely. The roar was apocalyptic. The centuries-old stone exploded in a shower of deadly shards. The iron of the bell screamed as it was ripped apart, and the enormous piece of metal, which had marked each dawn for 140 years, shattered mid-swing, its fragments raining down into the courtyard where the sisters cultivated medicinal herbs. The same hands that had caressed the mint and chamomile rose now, instinctively, to cover their ears against the roar of a new era. Sister Eleni did not scream. She stood. She raised the silver crucifix toward the dust that floated in the air, and, with a voice that did not tremble, began to sing. Kyrie eleison. Lord, have mercy. One by one from the ground, amidst the terror and the dust, the other voices joined hers. 23 raised against the clamor of an empire. But empires do not listen to songs. The fall of Constantinople. A new paradigm of conquest. To understand the coldness that hung over St. Catherine, we must look at the city that was once the beacon of all that these women stood for. In 1453, Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom, the Rome of the East, fell after a 53-day siege. It was a military catastrophe, yes, but it was much more. It was the declaration of principles for a new kind of empire. The 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II was not content with taking the city. He entered the Hagia Sophia Basilica, the grandest sacred space in Christendom, where the echoes of hymns had resonated for 9 centuries, and declared it a mosque. He did not do so because he needed another place of worship. He did so because he understood a psychological truth that most conquerors overlook. You do not defeat a people simply by killing their soldiers. You defeat them by erasing who they were. The crosses were torn down in a matter of hours. The golden mosaics depicting Christ and the saints were covered with plaster, not destroyed, but hidden, denied. The bells, symbols of the Christian community like that of St. Catherine, were melted down. Within a week, the Muslim call to prayer echoed from the dome that had cradled the Orthodox liturgy. This act was not impulsive looting. It was a choreographed message to the world. Your identity is malleable. Your history, rewritable. Your symbols are trophies. Mehmed II and the eradication of identity. Mehmed II, called Fatih, the conqueror, did not see his empire simply as an expanded territory, but as a unified organism under a single faith, a single law, and a single supreme identity, the Ottoman. When his eyes fell upon the scattered remnants of the Byzantine world, in Greece, the Balkans, the Aegean Islands, he saw not only lands to annex, he saw open wounds that refused to heal. Every bell that continued to ring, every monastery that remained standing, every cross that cast its shadow upon conquered land was an act of defiance, proof that the ancient world refused to die. And every nun, like those of St. Catherine, who continued to pray in Latin or Greek, was a living reminder that faith could outlast armies. Thus, the Sultan perfected a strategy more insidious than massacre. Massacre creates martyrs. Martyrs inspire resistance. Songs are written, stories are told, the dead become immortal. Mehmed wanted the opposite: oblivion. A silent and systematic disappearance. The Ottomans developed a methodology we might call erasure, the forced eradication of cultural and religious presence, not through immediate extermination, but through pressure, dissolution, and forced assimilation. By 1470, this strategy had already been tested in Greek monasteries in the Morea, in Serbian convents in the Balkans, in Armenian churches in Anatolia. Some were converted, others abandoned to a slow death in isolation. But the pattern was constant. First came the offer, then the silence, the offering and the refusal, the first act of the tragedy. It was then that Sister Eleni stepped forward. Her face showed neither anger nor panic, but an almost serene calm. She addressed not the soldiers but the translator, in Greek so clear and pure that everyone understood. "Tell your Sultan that we have already given our lives to a king. We have nothing left to surrender." Her response was not a cry of defiance, but a quiet affirmation of an alternate reality, a loyalty that transcended the powers of this world. The commanding officer, a man named Hassan Pasha, whose name appears in the Ottoman military records of the Thessalian campaign of the 1470s, did not respond with anger. His reaction was far more chilling. He offered a faint smile. It was not a mocking smile, but one of recognition. It was the smile of a man who saw a familiar protocol unfolding before him. Hassan Pasha knew something the nuns did not yet understand. The Ottomans had perfected the art of breaking people without killing them. Death was an end in itself. What they sought was transformation. Eleni's refusal was not the end of the drama. It was the first move in a long and meticulous game designed to drain of meaning the very faith she invoked with such certainty. Hassan Pasha's smile sealed the sisters' fate. They would not be sent to the glorious martyrdom that perhaps deep down one of them had imagined. They would be sent to something infinitely worse, a deliberate process of disintegration, where their own resistance would be used as a tool for their annihilation as individuals and as symbols. The storm had not come to sweep them away in one fell swoop. It had come to dissolve them, drop by drop, in the silence of the empire. Hassan Pasha's smile was the last human expression the sisters of St. Catherine saw for some time. After it, there was only procedure. The soldiers, with an efficiency devoid of unnecessary brutality, led the 23 women back to the heart of their own convent, the chapel. They didn't beat them, they didn't insult them. They simply locked them inside the most sacred space, the place where hours before they had sung their Kyrie eleison. Then they withdrew. It wasn't just any prison. It was a cell whose ceiling was the vaulted ceiling that had cradled their dreams, whose stained glass windows filtered the light that had illuminated their prayers. The first night, the silence outside was more terrifying than any scream. Beyond the thick stone walls, they could hear the daily life of the occupying army. Laughter, the clanging of metal, the smell of food cooking over fires. It was the sound of the world going about its business, indifferent to their imminent demise. In the darkest corner, two younger sisters, who had arrived from Corinth years before, began to sob. Her moans, amplified by the acoustics of the place, were echoes of a despair that threatened to infect them all. But then, in the gloom, a voice began to whisper. It was Sister Magdalena, the one with the calloused hands of a farmer. The prison in the sanctuary itself. The confinement in the chapel was the first phase of a meticulous psychological experiment. Hassan Pasha, a veteran of campaigns in the Balkans, had seen this resilience before. In his reports, he described faith as a candle that burns brightest just before going out. His strategy was not to extinguish the flame with a single breath, but to slowly deprive it of oxygen until it consumed itself. On the second day, the large oak door opened. No soldiers entered. A servant entered, a young man who avoided eye contact. He placed a jug of clean water and a basket of freshly baked bread in the center of the nave. Then, without a word, he left and closed the heavy door again. The aroma of the bread filled the cold, dry space. For the women, their throats raw with thirst and their stomachs empty for 48 hours, the temptation was palpable physical agony. The younger sisters looked at Sister Eleni with pleading eyes. It was Sister Theodora, the eldest, who broke the silence with a voice that crackled like dry parchment. They want us to take it, to feel gratitude, to soften. The abbess nodded. Her response was simple and devastating. Then we will fast. No one touched the food or the water. It was active rejection, an act of spiritual warfare. By the third day, several sisters' lips were cracked and bleeding. Their hands trembled uncontrollably. The road to the sea, the journey as a tool of elimination. On the third day, the door opened again. This time it was Hassan Pasha himself, flanked by the translator. His speech was another offer, wrapped in the impeccable logic of power. You are not criminals. You are not enemies. You are simply mistaken. The Sultan is merciful. He offers you new lives, new names, protection. You need only speak the words. The women's silence was their answer. Hassan continued, unfazed. Or you can come with us to Constantinople. There, the Sultan himself will hear your case. Perhaps he will be moved by your conviction. He paused, letting the word moved hang in the heavy air. But the road is long, and the weak do not survive it. It was not a threat. It was a factual promise, a law of physics applied to human bodies. Sister Eleni looked at her sisters. Some were semi-conscious, others prayed with their eyes closed, others sought strength in the flagstones of the floor. She turned her gaze to Hassan. We will walk, she said. The officer's smile reappeared. Good. We leave at dawn. That last night in the convent, the women embraced in the darkness. They didn't speak. It was Sister Magdalena who once again began to hum a melody, a Vespers hymn. Little by little, the others joined in. Outside, the soldiers on guard listened. Some paused. Others looked away. One of them, years later, would tell his grandson the story of the women who sang themselves into death. But that story, like so many others, would also be lost. For now, the hymn seeped through the cracks in the chapel walls and floated into the night. A prayer, a plea, a final declaration of presence. On the fourth day, the march began. 23 women, their hands bound with rough ropes, were lined up and marched south toward the coast. There were no carts, no horses, no provisions, only their feet, the dust of the road, and a merciless sun. The soldiers didn't hurry them. There was no need. The road itself was the punishment. Geography became their executioner. On the second day, Sister Irene, 62 years old, her knees ravaged by arthritis and a life spent on her knees, collapsed. She tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't respond. The soldiers didn't wait. It was Sister Magdalena, with her youthful strength, who, along with another sister, lifted her onto their shoulders and carried her for the next 5 kilometers. When the column stopped at nightfall, Irene was unconscious. By dawn, she had died. The sisters, their hands still bound, dug a shallow grave by the roadside with their fingers, without tools. There was no ceremony, only earth and whispered prayers. The transformation of Mother Ilani, the captured body, the indomitable soul, Sister Ilani had walked at the head of the column the entire way, leading even with her hands bound. But on the morning of the 7th day, Hassan Pasha gave an order. The abbess was taken to her tent, alone. What happened inside is not recorded in the Ottoman annals, which only document outcomes, not processes. The only glimpse we have into that moment comes from a letter from a Venetian merchant who was imprisoned in the Ottoman camp awaiting his ransom, discovered in the Dubrovnik archives in 2003. The man writes, "I saw them bring her back at dawn. She couldn't walk. Her eyes, God forgive me, her eyes were open, but she no longer inhabited them. They dressed her in silks and paraded her around the camp like a convert. But as I passed by, I heard her lips moving. She was still praying in Latin, silently. She hadn't broken. They had simply taken her body and left her soul to wander." This testimony is key to understanding the sinister sophistication of the Ottoman strategy. They didn't want martyrs. Martyrs inspire. Songs are written, stories are told, the dead become saints. They wanted ghosts, beings who could walk, breathe, eat, but who would never be whole again. Living proof that rebellion was futile. Walking warnings to anyone who thought faith could stand up to an empire. Sister Eleni walked the rest of the way to the coast, but she never spoke again. She never looked anyone in the eye. She was there, yet she wasn't. The younger sisters wept at the sight of her. The older ones, like Theodora, simply clutched their rosaries tighter and prayed with greater fervor. The abbess had become the perfect symbol of their Pyrrhic victory. They could destroy the vessel, but they could not spill the water it contained. The Manifesto of the Nameless, From People to Numbers, an Ottoman war galley, a wooden behemoth with rows of oars, awaited them in the port of Volos. It was not a passenger ship. It was a machine designed for the control and transport of human cargo, slaves, prisoners, plunder. The 18 surviving sisters were herded aboard and chained to the rowers' benches, their wrists cuffed to cold, rusty iron rings. A document discovered in 1987 in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, the ship's cargo manifest, records the final transaction of their humanity. No names appear. There is no reference to St. Catherine. It reads, "Religious captives, female, 18. Destination, Imperial household. Purpose, domestic service and conversion." The word service here is a monumental euphemism. They were slaves. The voyage across the Aegean Sea lasted 12 days. The indifferent sea became yet another accomplice in their ordeal. Storms lashed the deck, the salt water burned their chapped lips, and the ship's rolling made the women, who had never seen the ocean, vomit until their stomachs were empty. During the long nights, chained in the pestilent darkness of the bilge, the only sounds were the creaking of the woodwork, the splashing of the oars, and the panting of the other prisoners. And then, once again, a whisper arose. It was Sister Magdalena. Her voice, weak with thirst and exhaustion, murmured psalms once more. "From the depths I cried out to you, O Lord." The secret chapel. The horizon that rose before them on the 12th day was not liberation. It was the consummation of their captivity. The galley, cutting through the leaden waters of the Golden Horn, revealed the outline of Constantinople, not as the city of miracles and mosaics they had once dreamed of, but as a sharp, alien silhouette. Domes and minarets stood out against a pale sky, not as symbols of grace, but as the pinnacles of a gigantic stone cage. The Theodosian walls, which for a millennium had repelled armies, now closed in on them. The city that had been called the desire of the world was transforming before their exhausted eyes into the stage for their demise. From the docks, the 18 remaining sisters were led through a labyrinth of narrow streets, pushed along by a human river of merchants, soldiers, and slaves of every race. People stopped to stare. Christian nuns among the spoils were a rarity, even in an empire built on conquest. It was a calculated display, the defeated faith paraded like a trophy. Their march took them beyond the old districts, through the Imperial gardens where fountains sang a melody that no longer belonged to them, until they stopped, forced to kneel, in the very shadow of the building that encapsulated their tragedy, Hagia Sophia. At that moment, as the adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, resounded from the minarets that had replaced bells, one of the sisters, it is not known which one, murmured words that condensed centuries of mourning. "We are home, but it is no longer ours." The journey, however, was not over. They were not taken to the grand audience halls or the courtyards where viziers plotted. Their destination lay further down, much further down. Soldiers guided them through a side door, then up a stone staircase that wound into darkness, leading into a network of tunnels that smelled of dampness, compacted earth, and oblivion. Constantinople, the cage city. Their new life was an existence of whispers and shadows. By day they were assigned the most invisible and menial tasks in the palace, scrubbing floors in deserted corridors, washing mountains of linen, stoking the fires in the kitchens that fed a court they would never see. They were uniformed spectres, moving with their heads bowed, trained to be imperceptible. But at night, in the absolute silence of the tunnels, when the palace slept, and only the occasional creak of wood or the distant footstep of a guard broke the emptiness, they reclaimed their humanity. In the most remote corner of that subterranean world, they found an abandoned storage room, sealed behind a false wall of flimsy bricks. Carefully, one of them dismantled it just enough to create a secret entrance. Inside, there was room to kneel. And there, in the deepest darkness, they built the impossible. A chapel. They had no crucifix, no missal, no wine, no consecrated hosts. They had their memories, their fingernails, and despair transformed into devotion. With fragments of broken pottery, or simply with the calloused tips of their fingers, they began to carve into the soft stone of the wall. Cross after cross. Small, rough, deep. Each mark was a silent cry, an act of faith, an affirmation that they were still there. They used pieces of broken mirror to reflect the dim light of a stolen oil lamp, creating a flicker that mimicked a candle. A scrap of clean cloth became an altar cloth. Stale bread left over from the kitchens and a little water were their Eucharist. And every night, they gathered to recite from memory the psalms, the hymns, the prayers of the liturgy they could no longer celebrate. It was a mass without a priest, a communion without a church, a resistance built from the rubble of their lives. The modern discovery. Crosses carved with fingernails. For centuries, that room remained sealed, its secret guarded by dust and legend. Rumors circulated among the oldest servants of the now museum palace about Latin whispers that emerged from its depths on very still nights. A French diplomat in 1712 mentioned them in his writings, only to dismiss them as the superstitions of ignorant servants. Official history had no record of them. Until, in 2011, during routine restoration work in the lower tunnels of Topkapi Palace, a team of Turkish archaeologists, inspecting an inconsistency in a wall, removed a row of bricks that wasn't original. What they found on the other side left them speechless, breathless. The small, untouched chamber contained neither treasures nor documents. Its walls were covered, from top to bottom, with dozens upon dozens of hand-carved crosses. Hundreds of them. A mosaic of desperate faith etched directly into the rock. The vigil in the darkness, years of stolen prayer. Among that jungle of crosses, archaeologists found personal marks, coded messages of despair and hope. In one corner, they discovered the rough figure of a bird, carved with poignant care. Beside it, 23 lines were engraved in the stone, like a list. Only 11 of those lines were complete, marked with a small cross at the end. The other 12 were broken off midway, fading into the surface of the rock. It was the record of the sisters, those who remained alive and those who had fallen, a silent chronicle of their slow annihilation. But the most revealing find, the one that gave meaning to everything, was in the center of the main wall. There, carved in a firmer, deeper calligraphy, appeared 4 Latin words, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. It is a quotation from the Gospel of John, a verse that continues, "And the darkness did not prevail against it." This was no random scribble. It was a declaration of principles, a theological manifesto carved from the abyss. Through these vestiges, we can reconstruct her years of captivity. A testimony written by a Venetian prisoner rescued in 1478, found in the Venetian state archives, corroborates this clandestine life. Among the servants of the harem, there is talk of strange voices that rise from the deepest tunnels at night. Women who sing in a strange tongue to a god who is not the one of this palace. For years, perhaps a decade, these women kept watch.